Hello, Milwaukee Bucks fans. Welcome back to Bucks Latest presented by Fan Arch. I'm your host, Dean Simon. Please make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on those post notifications to stay up to date and in the know with all the latest Milwaukee Bucks updates. So, in this first one, coming from ESPN's Zach Kram, I won't necessarily call it a head scratcher because I can see how analysts and fans alike could come to this conclusion. But again, Zach Kram from ESPN, he came out with an article recently detailing every NBA team's biggest roster mistake or transactional mistake of the past half decade. And he said that the Milwaukee Bucks' biggest mistake of this half decade so far was trading for Damian Lillard. And I don't know if I can necessarily agree with it outright, but Cram said himself, and I quote, "Perhaps more than any other transaction on this list, the Bucks trade for Lillard seemed smart at the time. They needed a shakeup after a shocking 8-1 upset loss to the Heat in the 2023 playoffs. Their offense needed an upgrade, and Lillard seemed like a perfect fit next to Giannis Antetokounmpo, who signed an extension soon after the Bucks traded Drew Holiday, who was rerouted to Boston where he won a title, Grayson Allen, a future first-round pick, and two swaps in exchange for Lillard." So you could look at Damian Lillard's introduction to the Milwaukee Bucks getting Giannis to re-sign as a major victory in itself. But one thing that I really disagree with about this take and the rest of his take in general is just that of course you have to look at this deal with a revisionist lens and hindsight is 2020. But you can only say that it's their worst roster mistake of the decade through that hindsight is 2020 perspective, because at the time, like he mentioned in this little passage here, the Lillard move seemed smart at the time. It seemed overwhelmingly smart, and I don't know if anybody was not on board with that idea. I remember feeling myself as though the Bucks just cracked the code, that they were really going to compete for a title. They were going to at least make a conference finals run, that things were really going to turn around. And and a bunch of different factors played into this not working out, whether it was injuries or just inconsistency of not having both of those guys on the court at the same time for, decent stretches of Lillard's two seasons with the Bucks. Regardless, you can only say that this was the biggest mistake of the Bucks half decade through a revisionist lens, because I figured that this was a fantastic move, and so did the rest of the NBA landscape at the time. Of course, we see what it turned into, where we're gonna have to owe Damian Lillard $22.5 million over the next half decade until 2030, and now Dame and Drew Holiday are teamed up in Portland, which is a situation that I'm sure nobody, no one would have come to that conclusion after this season. But the only way, because Damian Lillard gave it his all. I'll just say flat out, there's nobody, and I've said this in recent episodes. There's nobody, I'm sure of it, in the NBA that has that burning passion, that burning desire to win at the highest level more than Damian Lillard. He wanted to compete for a title with the Portland Trailblazers, and then when he was finally fed up enough to ask for a trade, he goes to the Bucks where he has this great shot, but the blood clot, the torn Achilles, like all of these different things and smaller injuries throughout the course of the two regular seasons he was a part of the team just just hampered his ability to compete. And when he did play, he was a two-time All-Star. It put up great numbers this past year on pretty great efficiency. So I don't really agree with this. I feel like, if anything, you could even point to the Bucks trading away Chris Middleton and AJ Johnson to the Wizards for Kyle Kuzma. I won't say that that was a bigger mistake necessarily, that it didn't have more or it had less ramifications than the Damian Lillard move, but you could argue that that was not an equally as bad idea or bad trade, but you could at least look at the Middleton and AJ Johnson for Kyle Kuzma trade in that moment and think that there could be some negatives to this, because Kyle Kuzma proved that he has not been a consistent scorer at all for the Wizards. He's having the worst year of his career so far with the Wizards. So why are we hoping that he can really compete for the Bucks in a playoff series? You could realize that there were negatives of that trade in the moment, but in the moment of the Damian Lillard trade, I mean, everybody was caught up in it. There was no way that anyone would figure that it would lead to not a single playoff series victory. So that's just my thing on the Damian Lillard trade. I don't believe it was the biggest mistake of the 2020s for the Bucks from a roster building perspective, because you needed to do something in order to convince Giannis to stay, to convince him that you're still committed to winning as uh, a front office, as an organization, and you did that. So I don't really think it was the biggest mistake of the 2020s. Anyways, moving forward, Dalton Sell from Fanside had a really interesting point about DeLon Wright, and I know it's probably interesting for me to be mentioning his name, but uh, Dalton Sell, he kind of equated Torian Prince's situation right now with the Milwaukee Bucks. He kind of compared it to DeLon Wright's from this past year, and basically that when DeLon Wright was underperforming as a member of the Bucks when he came in and he was expected to not take on a bunch of responsibility, but he was supposed to be a wise veteran, a mentor maybe that could handle 15 to 20 minutes a night at the backup point guard spot. And when he didn't do that, Ryan Rollins immediately took his minutes, took his spot once he showed the littlest bit of progress. So he's saying that if Torian Prince were to underperform even a little bit this past year or this next year, maybe Chris Livingston is the one that takes the Ryan Rollins role and kind of, jumps in and takes Torian Prince's spot if he shows any bit of regression. But anyways, Dalton Sell, he said himself, during his short-lived stint with the team, DeLon Wright initially had the Milwaukee Bucks backup point guard opening locked up, but Ryan Rollins swooped in and took it. If Torian Prince fails to live up to expectations like Wright, he could end up being replaced in the rotation by another youngster, perhaps Chris Livingston, as the Bucks continue to emphasize their new reliance on youth. Of course, we saw what Chris Livingston did in the summer league this past year. Of course, through the G League, the past full regular season, and even small stints with the actual team at the NBA level. And we know the untapped potential that he has. We saw in the summer league him driving to the rim with reckless abandon, and he just has great footwork, great strength to bump off defenders and get open looks at the basket. His jump shot was going down more consistently, and it seemed as though he was flowing into his jump shots a little bit better. But Chris Livingston could potentially be that guy that if Torian Prince, while he's getting older, I feel like a lot of people don't realize how long he's been in the league. He's already about 31, 32 years old. If Torian Prince shows the slightest bit of regression, maybe it is Chris Livingston that after a couple of impressive games, maybe Doc Rivers starts to trust him more like he trusted Ryan Rollins more last year and kind of give him more chances to contribute to the team. My one thing is though, I don't think Torian Prince is going to have this major fall off where he's going to be going from shooting 44% from three this past year, one of the best pure shooters percentage wise in the NBA, to I don't think he's going to drop off to 37% and shoot 39% from the field and he's going to be unplayable enough for Chris Livingston to really for it to be justified that Chris Livingston steals his minutes, steals his spot in the rotation. I really am not convinced that Torian Prince is going to drop off that much going into next year. Again, while he is getting a little bit older, I think he's far from done making meaningful contributions to a winning team. He's still that kind of player for me. And Chris Livingston may or may not have still a while to go in terms of his development. But if he does have a couple of impressive performances this next year, he could get bumped up slightly into the rotation. Though there's not a lot of minutes to be had really in concerning the Bucks' depth. Anyways, going forward again, Marcus Johnson, Bucks legend, he had a recent appearance on the Here District podcast where he was talking about the addition of Cole Anthony, what it would do for the Bucks rotation, the Bucks scoring on either the back end of the rotation if he were to be the first guy coming off the bench or if he were to assume starting point guard responsibilities. And Marcus Johnson said that he and Miles Turner and Giannis on the floor at the same time, those three, I see some potential there. You're almost encouraging a guy like Cole Anthony to press up. And if a guy gets by you, we got Miles back there and we got Giannis back there. So Cole Anthony, I would beg to differ that he's still a pretty great defender for his stature, for his size. He can still stay in front of guys. But like Marcus Johnson is saying, even if a would-be attacker of the rim gets by him, you have to deal with arguably the best defensive front court duo in the NBA right now in Giannis and Miles Turner. Of course, they haven't taken the floor together yet, but you could just imagine that those two are going to wreak havoc on the defensive end and just as two of the best rim deterrents individually in the NBA. So if Cole Anthony does get blown by, maybe it's not all bad. It's not like he has to be perfect on the perimeter. And what that could do is it could help Cole Anthony reserve some energy, more energy for the offensive end because that's where the Bucks are really going to have him excel. As a guy that where if they need one-on-one shot creation, they know that they can go to Cole Anthony. He can at least get a decent shot off. He can, he's just a guy that's always been responsible for creating for himself when his teams need it most, even when he was a member of the Magic and he didn't really have any other outlets to go to in terms of consistent operators on the offensive end. But Cole Anthony himself is that guy. The Bucks are going to be depending on him a lot going into next year, and the front court duo of Miles and Giannis are going to help him a lot in terms of conserving that energy and keeping him in great shape as one of the Bucks' more go-to scorers, believe it or not. And finally, for today, uh, there's been growing optimism that maybe that Kyle Kuzma might have a pretty successful 2025-26 season, that he'll turn things around, that at least he'll be a little bit more of a consistent scorer on the offensive end. And Heavy Sports Mark Deeks, he maybe isn't completely with it with Kyle Kuzma, just completely turning things around and having a great year, but again, he's more optimistic than maybe others would be in this situation and after the regular season that Kyle Kuzma had, after the playoff run that Kyle Kuzma had. And Deke said that with Giannis still on the team, seemingly for the duration, of this iteration with the Bucks, both the Bucks and Kuzma have a foundation stone to operate around. Kuzma's value as a secondary slash tertiary playmaker, driver, transition threat, finisher, and decent shooter is there if he taps into it. In his days with the LA Lakers, Kuzma shone mostly as a role player, whether he was asked to play the 3 and D role, as a stretch 5, and as a starter or off the bench. One thing that I can agree with is that Kyle Kuzma throughout his career has worn many hats, whether he's just had to fill a lot of roles for pretty great teams, and of course he's an NBA champion and he was a pretty big contributor to a championship team. So Kyle Kuzma's been there before. I think really it's all about just getting him to buy in on the defensive end and have him be a little bit more serious on the other end of the floor. And I feel like his defense will in turn help the team get more key stops, get them out in transition, and it will lead to easier buckets for him on the break, which would then increase his efficiency and maybe help him get into more of a rhythm in certain games that the Bucks are, running up and down the floor a little bit more. Because of course that's how the Bucks want to play. And I feel like Kyle Kuzma, more than maybe anybody else on the roster other than Giannis, would benefit from this, style of play, from a more transition attacked focus. He would benefit from it plenty because he's so versatile as an offensive player. And if he can get a couple of easy buckets on the break, it'll help him in the half court kind of get into a rhythm. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Kyle Kuzma does turn things around from an efficiency standpoint, but it's going to be all about how the Bucks as a team are able to get stops on defense, whether he's going to contribute heavily to that on that end of the floor, if he's going to truly buy in, because it seems as though this past year he was just not focused. He just wasn't into it. And you could argue that maybe he was trying to get himself out of Washington by playing a little bit uninspired basketball. He was constantly airballing, and whether he was doing it on purpose is, no one really knows for sure, but it's definitely a possibility. So getting Kyle Kuzma to buy in on the defensive end, I feel like is going to be the key for the Bucks going into 2025-26, or one of their main prerogatives as they're going to try and make an unsuspectingly deep playoff run in the next season. So that'll be it for me today. Thank you very much for watching another episode of Bucks Latest, presented by FanArch. I've been Dean Simon. Again, make sure to like, tell me what you think in the comments, subscribe, and turn on those post notifications to stay up to date and in the know with all the latest Milwaukee Bucks updates. See you guys in the next one, and go Bucks.